Hi, welcome to another little introduction to one of George Herbert's poems, this time Denial. Curiously enough, and I've got to admit I didn't plan this, it turns out to be another early poem. And interestingly, it seems to have been placed next to Jordan in the first edition of the poems. Now, we don't know if this was Herbert's intention. I don't think it was. But there's a lot of points of crossover with Jordan. And it's a really interesting point of comparison. So the title, Denial, refers to two possible meanings. Number one, the refusal of a request. And number two, a contradiction or a refutation of an idea. So let's have a look at the poem, get rid of some of that, and have a read of a bit of it. When my devotions could not pierce thy silent ears, then was my heart broken, as was my verse. My breast was full of fears and disorder. My bent thoughts, like a brittle bow, did fly asunder. Each took his way. Some would to pleasures go, some to the wars and thunder of alarms. As good go anywhere, they say, as to benumb both knees and heart in crying night and day. Come, oh come, my God, oh come, but no hearing. Oh, that thou shouldst give dust a tongue to cry to thee, and then not hear it crying. All day long my heart was in my knee, but no hearing. Therefore my soul lay out of sight, untuned, unstrung. My feeble spirit, unable to look right, like a nipped blossom, hung, discontented. O cheer and tune my heartless breast, defer no time, so that so thy favours granting my request, that they and my mind may chime and mend my rhyme. So this is a poem expressing the agony of being cut off from God, the feeling that you can pray and God, as we hear twice in this poem, does not hear you. It's a really profound question that Christians have to grapple with. And God is supposed to be a loving God. It's supposed to be a God who cares about his creation. But there is this problem that prayers appear not to be answered. And the poem is dominated by this mood of anguish and of isolation. We'll look at a few little parts of it. It's quite a straightforward poem, I think, perhaps easier than the two poems, Jordan and Love, that we've looked at so far. The devotions of line 1 are prayers, and this image of piercing sets up some of the martial, that means military, imagery of the rest of the poem. It's a rather beautiful opening. Could not pierce thy silent ears, then was my heart broken, as was my verse. It's broken here, if you want a nice technical term, functions as a zeugma, which means one verb which governs two different terms. So the single word broken refers to a heart and also to his verse. One of the things that's worth noticing about this poem is the extensive use of sin. Ooh, heavens to Betsy, I can't spell today. Cynic, doke. Cynic doke is a technique in rhetoric whereby you use a part of the body, in this case, to represent the whole of it. So you'll notice that the disorder in Herbert's spirit is represented by a very disordered presentation of the body. We have hearts, we have knees and heart, we have tongues, we have souls and spirits, we have breast here early in the poem, we have knees, and I think Herbert does this very deliberately to convey that feeling of things being out of joint, of being disconnected. So anyhow, the image of the first stanza is very much that he prays with his devotions, and when he hears nothing from God, or God does not respond, his breast is full of fears and disorder. Now, the second stanza introduces a really rather clever metaphor in the poem. The word bow in this poem can have two meanings. It can be a bow as in a bow and arrow, and it can be a bow as in the bow of a violin. And the two metaphors, one military and the other musical, are important throughout the whole poem, because his bent thoughts, this image of bent perhaps meaning, on the one hand, diverted from their correct path, but also twisted back. And he gives us this rather powerful image of a brittle bow. If you imagine a bow and arrow where the wood is brittle and old, it will fly asunder, it will fly apart. It's a very dramatic image of something snapping under pressure. Each thought took his way. In the next line, some thoughts would to pleasures go, some to the wars and thunder of alarms. Alarms here is a trumpet call, summoning men to war. The next stanza leaves behind the rather panicky imagery of flying asunder, of wars and thunder of alarm, because it turns to an image of rather hopeless despair. As good go anywhere, they say. As to benumb, in this sense, to make numb both knees and heart. Again, another zeugma, same effect as broken, because you're benumbing not only your knees, but you're also benumbing your heart in crying night and day, come, come, my God, O come. Now here, Herbert is evoking the language of the Psalms. In particular, you might wish to look up Psalm 102, verse 2. And also of Psalm 13, verse 1. Have a look at those, and you will get the spirit of this tone of lamentation, which is very important in this poem. Lamentation means to express grief or despair, and I think this image of your knees and your heart being so worn with care, and in fact you spend so long on your knees praying that they become numb, and your heart spends so long at prayer that it itself becomes numb. It's a powerful image of the despair of this lamentation. And note then how the tone of the poem changes in line 16. Oh, that thou shouldst give dust a tongue to cry to thee, and then not hear it crying. This seems to be the central idea of the poem, and actually if you look at it, that's where it's placed in the poem itself. I'll try and make that a little bit clearer. It's at the heart of the poem, and the paradox appears to be God has given dust a tongue. He has given dust a voice, in this case, to cry to thee, and then not hear it crying. All day long my heart was in my knee. Why was his heart in his knee? Well, he was in prayer. To be kneeling is to present yourself to God in a posture of humility. And I think it's a rather touching image. All day long my heart was in my knee, but no hearing, but no hearing. Note how this line here has been repeated. The poem then moves to its conclusion of its argument in line 21. Therefore my soul lay out of sight, untuned, unstrung. And we're going back here to this image of a bow, which we encountered in line 6, the brittle bow. Untuned, unstrung. On the one hand, the musical instrument. If you imagine a violin whose strings aren't tuned, or a guitar whose strings aren't tuned, they're slack. They lack the necessary tension to be able to vibrate and make music. Unstrung in the sense of a bow is useless, that it is of no service to anyone. So that's the music, and again the warlike imagery, the martial imagery, once again, martial. The next metaphor, or the next simile that we're offered, is this image of a nipped blossom. A nipped blossom, as we find here, is the bud of a flower which is killed off by frost. So a nipped blossom is a blossom which has never had a chance to grow into a full flower. Again, a very beautiful image of Herbert's spiritual state. And then the poem ends not with an expression of further despair, but with the only response which a Christian can make, a prayer, O cheer and tune. Tune here means to bring into harmony. And in the time that Herbert was writing, music was all about harmony. It was less important, in fact, the melody that we would consider now to be the heart of music. Harmony was what music was all about. So to have your heart tuned is to be brought back into harmony with itself. So all the disharmony emphasised through these Cynic dokes, or through the use of Cynic doke in this poem, the disharmony will be overcome. I rather love this image of my heartless breast, that image of emptiness. Anyhow, defer no time means simply waste no time, that so thy favours granting my request, they and my mind may chime, in this sense may rhyme together. Again, a very beautiful musical image here, and mend my rhyme. I rather like the ending of this poem. It's a fascinating contrast to the confidence of the last line of Jordan, for example, who plainly say, my God, my King. The poem reaches a conclusion, but we're not sure how powerful and how durable this conclusion is going to be. It is a prayer, there's confidence, but the conclusion hasn't actually been reached. So now some critical questions for you to consider as you look at this poem. The first question I'd like you to think about is the form. The form of this poem is really striking. People have said it reminds us of this brittle bow, of something flying asunder and falling apart. And the first question I'd like you to consider is the form of the poem a distraction? Nothing more than what Colley describes as a piece of arbitrary wit. So that's our first critical question that we need to consider about this poem. Is its form a distraction, nothing more than what one critic has described as a piece of arbitrary wit, or do you find that it actually, in some way, meaningfully adds to your experience of reading the poem? The question I'd like you to ask yourself next is, how satisfactory do you find the conclusion? I'd like you to consider there. Do you feel it? Do you really feel that a resolution has been reached, or is this sort of just a rather hollow resolution? The last part is to consider who's denying whom in this poem. Is it God or man? So, is God denying man, or is man denying God? So, 3 little questions for you to consider, and something to discuss in class. Thanks very much for listening.